I want to talk to you about something we're going to celebrate in less than 2 years. It's vitally important to the hiking community across the country, and we're all more or less familiar with it, but most hikers don't know a whole lot about the 1968 National Trail Systems Act. What the heck? It's 48 years old. And in less than 2 years, we're going to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the National Trail Systems Act. What's in it? Why did Congress pass this very, very important piece of legislation? Well, I want to start my talk by talking about the Act. In the 20s, you probably know, the vision of Benton MacKaye came to fruition in the construction of the Appalachian Trail. The 30s, we had a war in the 40s. In the 50s and 60s, what began to happen is that a lot of the folks who had been kind enough to let the Appalachian Trail go through their property would sell the property to somebody perhaps who didn't want it, who would die, didn't want the trail, who would die, leave the land to maybe children who didn't want the trail going through it. And so the Appalachian Trail Conference, as it was called in those days, was constantly relocating the trail. Sound familiar? And so, in fact, Chuck Sloan, who passed away last year, that name may be familiar to some of you, he said to me that at every quarterly board meeting we were dealing with this problem of trail relocations. As a result of this, and we had no other significant trail in the country comparable to the Appalachian Trail, but as a result of this and the efforts of some people in Northeast Florida, particularly in the Washington, D.C. area, Congress addressed the issue of how to save the Appalachian Trail. Well, as you might guess, the Midwestern states and the far western states really didn't have any interest in this subject. So they had trouble getting the votes. And from that emerged a vision of a national trail system. So in other words, we'd save the AT today, and tomorrow we would look at other trails that other volunteers were building around the country and maybe include them in a national trail system. And so that's what happened. So in '68, Congress passed the National Trail Systems Act and identified the Appalachian Trail as a trail of national significance that needed Congress's help. Also mentioned in the trail was the Pacific Crest Trail, but it was just a mention. I mean, that's my view of it. Well, time went on, and the initial legislation said that the states would see to it that the right-of-way was preserved through their state. And most of the states didn't do much. I think Maryland, I think Massachusetts, honestly, not much happened. And so 10 years later, Congress held oversight hearings to find out what was wrong, what wasn't working. 1978, that was a propitious year for me personally. I got a phone call from the man who had founded Backpacker magazine a couple of years before, and he told me about this oversight hearing in Congress. I didn't know anything about it. And he said that a guy named Paul Pritchard, who was then the president of the Appalachian Trail Conference, was going to come and speak. He was going to come and speak. And a young man named Destry Jarvis, active as a lawyer and in conservation issues in Washington. Would I come? He said, you're the one guy that started a trail. So Kemsley had founded a magazine. Pritchard was running the AT conference, and Jarvis was running the Youth Conservation Corps. So I went up there, and the four of us, and I don't remember that there was anybody else who spoke outside of, there might have been some government folks, But I think, I don't want to be unfair to anybody, but I think the four of us spoke. As a result of the oversight hearings, they took the chores of acquisition away from the states and they gave them to the Park Service. And so the National Park Service opened an office in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and then began slowly over decades the acquisition of the right-of-way of the Appalachian Trail. What the Act specifically gave the AT was money and eminent domain. Those two big items. So eventually, that little office, added people. They had to search the title, the record holders, the record owners of land from Maine to Georgia. They had to knock on doors and talk to people about their property, tell them they wanted to buy a right-of-way or a scenic easement, whatever it was. Laborious, very laborious. The man who runs that office today is Don King. I said, Don, surely you had a form contract that you could just show people. He said, no, they didn't. I mean, I'm in the real estate business. This was the largest acquisition in the history of the Park Service. 2,550 transactions. And they didn't have a form that they used because everybody was different. One guy's in Georgia, one guy's in Maine, you know. And they dealt very, I think, diplomatically and in a very sensitive manner with everybody. Jim King, the attorney who closed about 25% of the deals through the U.S. Forest Service, told me that not one person, imagine this now, the trail's about 2,100 miles long. They had to buy 700 miles. Not one person was chased out of their home. Well, in part, you can see we don't want to put a trail where their homes. So that's part of it. But I mean, they were very, very careful to be diplomatic, and they gave life estates to people and things like that. But anyway, so that's the way, that's how things got going. And then other trails, the Pacific Crest Trail, and then along comes the, I'm not going to count the historic trails right now, but the Ice Age Trail, the Florida Trail in '83, the Arizona Trail, the North Country Trail, the Northwest Trail, and so on. They were added to a national trail system. No other trails out of the 10 that were added. There are now 11 National Scenic Trails. No other trails but the AT got sufficient funds and eminent domain and a staff to acquire the right-of-way. And we have languished like that ever since. And I feel like we're languishing today. Let's take the Ice Age Trail, for example. Their dream is to have an 1,100-mile trail. They have about 600 miles that's set aside and secure. They've got about 500 to go. They add about 10 or 12 miles a year. Now, folks, you know, that's a long road ahead of them. And the hiking community has just simply, we're not groupies. We're the opposite of groupies. We're like herding cats, like they say. And we don't work effectively, you know, I know these are generalizations, but nevertheless, we want to just be left alone, and we want to go hiking and look at the trees, and I want to bird watch. And so we don't work effectively, in my experience, in political arenas, at political levels to get the job done. We're not very good at fundraising either, to be honest with you. So that's a little background. Now I want to digress for just a moment before we come back to this issue and tell you a little bit about myself and this journey. I mentioned my essay in the back of my book, Trail Reflections. But, so I founded the trail in '66, and in a couple of years I was starting to think, jumping ahead, which is my the way I dream, I'm a step ahead of my ability to get anything done. So I'm dreaming about what's coming, and I'm dreaming about the completion of this trail, and wondering what the problems will be, and realizing I would like to get the state involved. And lo and behold, along about 1970, Dick Pettigrew, who lived in Dade County where I was living at the time, was elected Speaker of our House, the Florida House. And I knew somebody who knew him. And I asked him if he would introduce me to Dick Pettigrew. So he did. And I asked the Speaker if he would introduce a bill to preserve the Florida Trail, just as what was happening in Washington with Congress and the 1968 Act. How about something in Florida for the Florida Trail, entirely within the borders of our state? So Dick said, yeah, he can handle that. He got somebody to draft a bill, I don't know who. The bill got filed. Now there are hearings. I get a call, go to Tallahassee to appear at the hearing, and I want to tell you, it was like leading a lamb to slaughter. I mean, I was there with the big boys, and I had this dream, and I think I was by myself. I don't even think if anybody was holding my hand on that day, I don't remember. But I want to tell you something. The cattle industry, the forestry department, the forestry companies, and the Citrus Commission, they made short work of me. In about 5 minutes I was finished, because the hikers were going to pick the fruit off the tree. The bulls were going to gore the hikers. And you know, they painted such a gloomy picture, and you know how strong these industries are. I mean, that was the end of it. And I kept this dream alive in my head, thinking, you know, years down the road, how are we going to get it done? So this was now 2001, and I met a very well-connected lobbyist in Tallahassee, Wade Hopping. He helped me out on a personal matter. And we were having lunch, and at the end of the lunch I said, Wade, I have a request. And I told him the dream of completing the trail. Would you introduce a bill for me? I said, I'm not on the board of the Florida Trail. I'm not an officer. I'm just I'm just a Florida citizen. And this is a dream that I have of seeing this thing complete. So Wade had somebody in his office draft the bill. The executive director at the time caught wind of it, or maybe I just told her, it doesn't matter. But anyway, she said, Jim, I wish you wouldn't do that. And I said, look, I'm just one, you know, I haven't been on the board for years of FTA. This is just something I want to do. You won't be tainted by this. So we filed the bill. The very next day, Deseret Farms calls up and says, we're taking back our land. You can't go through it anymore. So you see, you have to be pretty strong in the state of Florida to stand up against Deseret Farms, don't you? Now we have something that Deseret Farms doesn't have. We have votes. We have lots of votes. So if we want to do anything, and we need the state of Florida to do it, if we want to do anything in the Congress, we have to get the votes. It's all about votes. This past week, an executive, head of advertising for JanSport said, I guess you're going to need a lot of money. And I said, Ann, no, we need a lot of votes. We might need the money to get the votes, but what we need are votes. Does Florida want the Florida Trail? Do the people of Florida want the Florida Trail for their state? We have to tell our story so these people, if they knew, I'm certain an overwhelming majority of people in Florida would want to have a trail through a foot trail through their state. No doubt in my mind about that. Well, anyway, that was 2001. 2011, I published Trail Reflections, which I just told you about, and the appendix in that sharing my heartfelt dream. And then in 2013, I founded Hiking Trails for America. And I called up some influential people and I said, look, I need your name. I need your good name for trails. Would you be on the board? And so Bill Kemsley obliged me, Paul Pritchard obliged me, Skip Yowell, founder of JanSport, obliged me, Goody Gaskill, who came here for one of our board meetings, founded the Colorado Trail. Ron Strickland founded the Pacific Northwest Trail. So we put together a board of directors, and then the following year I founded Friends of the Florida Trail for one purpose. And I was so concerned that I get this message across to the board that I went to a board meeting and spoke to the Florida Trail Board. And I said, look, I'm going to support the Florida Trail Association in one narrow way, and that is in every respect that you're building and maintaining and protecting the Florida Trail. That's what this is all about for me. In all the other pursuits, which are all worthy, we're not going to be involved. But this one mission, and if you read the statement, if you go on friendsofthefloridatrail.org and read the mission statement, you'll see it's a twofold mission. Back the Florida Trail as it builds back the Florida Trail Association as it builds the Florida Trail, and do what we can to complete the Florida Trail, whatever it takes. So what does it take? What are the options? I can't come up with any template for this chore other than what is embodied in the '68 Act. Now, other people disagree with me about this, and I think Carlos would like a word at the end of this talk to express the views of the board. But I don't see anything else that's going to work but the template that's laid out in the '68 Act. Lots of money and eminent domain. Liz Bergeron is the president right now of the Partnership for the National Trails. She's not enthusiastic about that. Bruce Matthews, the executive director of the North Country Trail. He's going to complete this long trail, much longer than the AT, with public and private partnerships. I don't get it. I don't see how it's possible. That's why I'm here. That's why I founded these two nonprofits in the last 2 years. Because to me, the template is what Congress did in '68. And the problem is that lots of money is tough and eminent domain is tough. Eminent domain is a dirty word, and I can see why. When the founders wrote the Constitution, they put in there the right of government to take a person's property. Well, that is very, very powerful, and it's a very confrontational issue, and it should be. Nevertheless, every county can take land for a school board. I take my own car down to a guy in St. Augustine who's got a shop. He's grandfathered in right behind right behind his house, and the house faces the airport. And the airport wants his property, and the airport authority is taking his property. Goes on every day. I don't think there's a railroad or a gas line or a canal or a power line or a highway in America that's 1,000 miles long that's ever been built without eminent domain. If there is one, please tell me, because I use that quote a lot. So, a foot trail is not a utility. It's outdoor recreation. But I want to call it a transportation corridor. Anyway, there's all kinds of outdoor recreation. But I submit to you that we might, and I mean we, the hikers, I'm not talking about people that run around the U.S. forests in ATVs. If you can give them a square mile to tear up, Sean, maybe they'd be willing to stay restricted in there and just, destroy the habitat. But hikers have this long, thin corridor that they want. And boaters all have public access to all the, there's no question there. Of course, there's a much, much smaller group of people on horseback and so on. You've got snowmobilers up north. You've got a horse community out west. We share out west the trails with the horse community, so that's not a problem. But in terms of outdoor recreation, people who want to hike on a footpath are in a singular niche of their own. And I think part of the story we have to tell is, yes, this is outdoor recreation, but please consider it in this exceptional way, more like a transportation corridor, narrow and long. And so that's part of the story that we have to tell. But I said earlier that we aren't getting our story out, we aren't talking about it, and we don't have expectations, and we don't ask, so we don't get. I want to tell you just a little bit of story about that. I heard a few years ago about how the Partnership for the National Trails and the American Hiking Society and the leadership in our country was going to get Congress to grant, they had figured $61 million that they were going to use for trails around the country, historic trails, scenic trails, which are hiking trails, and Congress finally acted last year, a year ago. I want to go over this with you. It's very, very important to take a look at these numbers because I got a memo from a key guy in the hiking community, liaison between government and the private clubs, who said, look, Jim, look what we've done. Okay, I want to tell you what they did. Congress didn't give them the $61 million. They gave $28 million. So I started to look where it was going. Of the 28 million, historic trails got 15.3 million of the 28 million. The Appalachian Trail that was completed 5 years ago, and it took 30 years for all those 2,500 acquisitions to be made, they have viewshed issues. My gosh, we haven't even completed our trail, you see? But they've got viewshed issues. They don't want a racetrack built, or a windmill or a high tension line. So those lucky dogs have those kind of problems. They've got $3 million. So 15.3 plus 3 million, we're up to 18.3 million out of 28. We got trails, all the other 10, they got 9 million to share. Now, back in the 50s, back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Congress spent $200 million buying up 700 miles of the AT. That's what it took. Now, that's a lot of money. But I want to tell you something. One huge interchange in our interstate system here in Florida will cost about $200 million. So we're talking about one interchange in Florida, not a little one. That might go for 30, 40 million. But anyway, I want to put it in perspective. And furthermore, they had 30 years to raise the money. It wasn't one lump sum, and that's part of our good story. That's a story we can tell. This is slow moving. So what we need is to annually go after this, year after year. If America wants these scenic trails, they have to see that they're safe for posterity. And we in Florida have to see that, that we're setting this land aside for posterity. That's what it's about, posterity. So that's why I formed the Hiking Trails for America in 2013 and Friends of the Florida Trail in 2014. And I want to see this through. I'm afraid I'm going to die before the Florida Trail is finished. And I want to see it. So I've written the governor and I've asked to take him on a hike this winter. I was up there September 20th to receive a proclamation. Sean and Megan were with me. We had a good group. So was Day. We've gotten some good press. We were in the Florida Times Union about 2 weeks ago. We were in the Orlando Sentinel yesterday. Bill Kemsley has written a guest editorial for the upcoming issue of Backpacker magazine. The current editor of Backpacker magazine has come on the board of Hiking Trails for America. 2 days ago, I spoke with Sharon Houghton, the publisher of Backpacker magazine. She said, "We're in, count us in. What do you want?" So we've started that dialogue. So we're gonna push for the two things that we need: money and eminent domain. If there's any other template that anybody thinks will work, I'll listen. But Congress has already shown us how to do it. And I want to see us replicate the AT experience, not just for the Florida Trail, but for all the other trails around the country. The Pacific Crest Trail is missing 10%. I wonder if you knew that. So 10% of a 2,600-mile trail is not secure. You're going to hike on it today, so you're not going to be thinking about it. You're not going to be walking along that trail and saying, this thing could be gone in 5 years or next week, because it's there right now. You don't realize it's vulnerable. Well, the entire Arizona Trail is all on public land. What's their problem? They have access problems. Getting on the Arizona Trail is a real problem. The Ice Age Trail I mentioned to you. So they're missing. But the mood is, let's not make enemies with our dear friends who own this land up in the hills, because, they'll kick us off, like Deseret kicked us off. That's what happened to the AT. It was an awkward time. There's always an awkward time when this happens. But without that awkward time, the acquisition never happens. And so the road never gets built. And so that's where I'm headed. I invite you to join. And if you care to be kept informed about this, there's a very easy way for you to do it. And I hope everybody in the room will simply go to friendsofthefloridatrail.org, give me your name and email address, and we'll keep you informed. And someday before I die, I hope I walk end to end on protected land, from Big Cypress to Fort Pickens. Thanks.